If you've been scrolling through endless tables of audio gear, watching endless best of videos, and still feel stuck on whether a 16-channel analog expansion is really worth the slot in your rack, this review is here to clear that up. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. I spent a solid week wiring up a Pro Tools HD system with a mix of vintage outboard, a few synths, and a couple of field recorders, then swapped the Avid HDI/016x16 in and lived with it for a typical production day. The goal was to see if the promise of a premium interface for your Pro Tools HD rig translates into something that actually saves you time, keeps your workflow smooth, and doesn't become a costly piece of dead weight. First, let's talk about the kind of studio that usually ends up reaching for a 16x16 analog I/O. You're probably running a Pro Tools HD system already, maybe a HDX or a HD native, and you've hit a wall where the built-in I/O simply isn't enough for all the gear you want to integrate. You might have a rack full of compressors, a handful of analog mixers, and a couple of hardware reverbs that you still swear by, but you keep having to bounce tracks or reroute cables just to get everything into Pro Tools. The Avid HDI/0 slots right in between the HD interface and your outboard, giving you 16 inputs and 16 outputs that sit on the same digital backbone as your existing HD hardware. In plain English, it means you can plug a microphone into channel 1, a line-level synth into channel 9, and a stereo return from your analog console into channels 15-16. And all of that shows up in Pro Tools without any extra converters or latency-inducing bridges. From a practical standpoint, the biggest strength I noticed was the seamless integration with Pro Tools HD's internal clock. Because the HDI/0 talks over the same HD-SDI link, there's no extra jitter or drift that you sometimes get when you add a separate FireWire or USB interface. During my test day, I ran a live drum tracking session while simultaneously pulling in a hardware synth, an analog console mix, and a handful of outboard effects. The DAW never missed a beat, and the round-trip latency stayed comfortably under 1 millisecond, which is essentially invisible even for tight rhythmic performances. That kind of timing fidelity is a non-negotiable for anyone who records drums, orchestras, or any high-resolution source where timing errors become audible. Another real-world advantage is the way the HDI/0 handles channel strip routing inside Pro Tools. The I/O window mirrors the physical layout. Inputs 18 correspond to the front panel's first 8 XLR/TRS combos, and outputs 916 line up with the rear panel's line-level outputs. That visual match cuts down on the mental gymnastics of figuring out which software channel maps to which piece of gear. When you're in the middle of a mix and need to send a few tracks out to a hardware compressor for parallel processing, you just drag the send to the appropriate output number, hit send, and you're done. I found that this one-tune mapping saved me at least 15 minutes of patch cable hunting during a typical 6-hour mixing session. Now, let's address the hidden trade-offs that often get glossed over in spec sheets. The first is space. The HDI/0 is a full-height 19-inch rack unit, and it needs a dedicated slot in your rack. If you're already pushing the limits of your rack space, you'll need to rearrange or possibly invest in a larger chassis. That's a cost you don't see in the price tag but can be a deal-breaker for smaller project studios. Second, power consumption is higher than a typical USB audio interface. The unit draws a fair amount of power from the rack's power supply, which means you need a reliable power strip or a UPS that can handle the extra load if you're on the road. In my own setup, I didn't notice any power dips, but it's something to keep in mind if you're planning a mobile recording rig. The value proposition of the Avid HDI/0 really shines when you already own an Avid HD system and you need more analog I/O without adding another digital converter box. The cost of the unit is higher than many standalone analog interfaces, but you're essentially buying an expansion that lives on the same backbone, which means you don't have to buy a second set of drivers, worry about clock sync, or compromise on latency. For a studio that relies heavily on outboard gear, think classic SSL compressors, vintage tape emulators, or a hardware summing mixer, the ability to keep everything in the same digital domain is priceless. In contrast, If you're a producer who works almost exclusively in the box with virtual instruments and plugins, the HDI/O becomes an overkill. You could get a 2-in/2-out USB interface for a fraction of the price and still have all the functionality you need. A practical weakness I encountered was the limited flexibility of the